Hi, this is Ben McDougal, and I'm the lead shading artist for Theory Studios, working out of Frozen, Connecticut. My primary focus is on shading, so like materials and texturing and stuff. I have experience with nearly every step of the workflow, from researching and modeling all the way to lighting, rendering, and compositing. And I'm here to talk about our work on Man in the High Castle Season 2, specifically the Germania establishing shot in episode 204. And that's this shot right here. Now, this shot was one of the most complex shots we've ever attempted, and one that pushed Blender way harder than I could have imagined going in. From utilizing over 3,000 assets and over 1,000 texture maps, clocking in at about 5 gigabytes of textures, to linking in hundreds of additional assets ranging from trees to people to cars, we were faced with one massive challenge. How do we do this? So first, let's take a look at what I consider the most impactful part of this scene, the Volkshalle itself. That's this large building back here. So this scene alone is what most would consider enormous. It's over 12 million triangles before subdivision, 227 objects, and using 3 gigabytes of memory just to navigate, which, by the way, peaks at 16 gigabytes during render, and that's just for this, not even including the rest of Germania. But nothing is impossible for us at Theory, so we utilized everything Blender has to offer to break this up into a manageable set. And the first thing you can see is we make heavy use of the layer management add-on, which comes with Blender. It's something that allows us to name the different layers and kind of keep them organized so we know exactly what we're working on. And when a project gets passed from artist to artist, it allows that new artist to kind of just look at it and see, oh, these are what all the different layers are. And considering these assets are being linked into the main Germania scene, as long as the meshes are grouped properly for easy linking, as you can see, we use groups heavily, it gives us the freedom to place the actual meshes themselves on any layer we feel like. We generally reserve layer 20 for hidden layer, so for assets that would be instance, work in progress, meshes, and things like that. But since the scene is being linked in, we don't have to worry about that at all. We can use all the layers for everything. And each object is named, UV'd, and has a unique material. We do use arrays where possible, but there are limited options for dealing with repeating textures in that context. So we found it was best to collapse the arrays where possible. So for something like this, these columns right here, it was originally an array, but for texturing workflow, to keep the textures unique on each one, it was better to just collapse it into one object and then work from there. And since the Volkshalle itself is humongous, the viewer never really sees more than half of the dome at a time, or really more than half of the whole Volkshalle. So what we found was we were able to do things like mirror parts of it. Generally, we worked in half, sometimes in quarters. And besides helping with the repetition, it also helped a bit with texture resolution, giving us almost double the resolution. Whereas like normally, if this was the whole object, even with 8K textures, this is being rendered out in 4K, or it's actually being rendered out in 8K, but it is finalized in 4K for Amazon. So 8K textures going across the whole thing might not even be good enough of a resolution. And another trick that we used for the materials itself to make things work better was using multiple UV sets. Oops. So what we did for this was have a base UV, close this, which would be just kind of like a standard. Since this was originally arrayed, we built one of these and then arrayed it around in the circle. So for the base material, the UVs are overlapping, so it's the same texture for each one of these little columns. But then what we did was we add a second UV map, which is a grunge UV map. Now this is done with the mesh as a whole, nothing overlapping, broken up into individual sections for each part. And what this allows us to do is have an overlaid grunge material on top of the base material. And this way, we can have a repetitive base material that looks great, but is still repeating. But on top of that, have a separate grunge map, which can have a unique texture going across the entire surface. And this was something that we found benefited us immensely. It allowed us to totally break up repetition, to make things look good, and to have different grunge going around based on what would realistically happen. So for these here, let's see if this actually renders. And as you can see, this stuff is pretty huge, so even with a powerful video card, it slows down. But yeah, as you can see for these here, they have grunge, which kind of spreads across based on where it would in reality. Maybe a little more on the top, kind of around the edges, and we can keep it going across the whole deal. And that's pretty much it for the Volkshalle itself. It was a relatively complex feature set to get going, but now we can move on to the crown jewel, the Germania scene. Now, as you can see, that one scene, that Volkshalle that we linked in, which was 12 million triangles and uses 3 gigabytes of memory and everything, that's just one tiny part of the whole Germania scene. Right now, just to navigate this, in the Blender viewport, it's using 10 gigabytes of memory and 15 million or 16 million triangles, and that does not include the subdivision or the LinkedIn information. So, as you can see, this is also split into a number of render layers, or a number of layers, but what we do for our actual scenes is these layers are what we use as the render layers. Since something this complex couldn't realistically be rendered in one pass, and the Barnstorm needs multiple passes for the compositing, it is split up in such a way that we have a mid-ground layer, Volkshalle background, courtyard, the Volkshalle itself, and so on. And we use an internal add-on which allows us to easily gather selected layers for rendering. So we can have all these different layers, check them all, and then if we hit gather checked, it would automatically set them up with the proper outputs, and it connects with deadline for our rendering to allow us to have the output path renamed as we're submitting the job, so we don't have to worry about opening up Blender each time and making sure that the outputs are correct and everything. And that's been a very helpful tool. Oops. All right. And as you can see, the scale of the scene is crazy. Oh, did I just lose it? Yep, looks like I just lost it. So let me open it again. This is the other thing too, with scenes of this size, like you do run into Blender crashes just from the amount of data it's pulling. So it's just a reality of it. But with a scene this crazy, we had to use a number of tricks to actually get it working. One of the big things we do is using empties with group duplication. And it allows us to do something like place dozens of copies of a single object everywhere, or a asset, not even just a single object, while keeping it as one object, one empty to move. So for something like a lamp, which could be made up of a lens, it could be made up of the base, a stand, different greebles hanging off of it and stuff, we can have that all as individual objects, but use the empty to place it wherever we want and just move that around. So in the case of the spear lamp here, you can see this is just an empty. That's all it is, and we keep the actual mesh itself on layer 20 to keep it out of the way, and it makes it so much easier. We don't have to worry about, oh, you clicked on the wrong thing and moved just part of it instead of the whole group. And another trick that we do for performance reasons to make it easier for the artist is setting certain objects to display as bounding box or wireframe in the viewport, and doing things like turning off the particle systems for the grass in trees, which having those visible would kill performance. It would make it impossible for artists to deal with it. And if you look at the grass right here, it's a little tangent on it. The grass alone was one of the more complex parts of the scene. Each section is 2 particle systems, and each of those particle systems has both the normal set and child particles. So I believe it's 9,600,000 grass particles just on this right section alone, which is quite a bit. And once you start adding in the crazy requirements for rendering with light bouncing off of them and stuff, you can see why it's better to render it all in as separate layers instead of all at one go. Now, if I enable the grass, you can see the kind of impact it has on the performance and how it's just not even feasible for an artist to deal with. And we also make heavy use of groups. This is something I highly recommend, even if you're just an individual artist, not working with a team, is use groups for everything. It makes it so much easier. Like, if you go and look at the assets in the scene has almost 3,000 objects. So if you want to find a specific group of them or something, let's say I wanted to find that fountain, instead of having to sit here and type fountain and hope you can find it, you can have it grouped up, and you can search for it that way, or you can look around, and you can have groups kind of stacked. So what we do is we'll have the individual assets set up as the tree will have its own asset, roof greebles, vents, things like that. And then we have the stacked assets, so all long buildings, all roof details, and so on, where we have all the separate groups in one larger group. And this makes it easy when passing from artist to artist again, so that they can see, oh, well, I'm working on this specific asset. It's going to be right here. And one thing that a scene of this scale, even though the camera is a pretty far distance away, because Amazon finishes in 4K, we need to make sure that people with those 70-inch 4K screens would actually benefit. So we took a lot of care to make sure that all the different assets, really no matter where they are in the scene, are high quality. So something like this, this sidewalk in front of the Reichstag right here, like you'd think, okay, in the actual scene itself, it's with the trees there, you can barely see it. So like looking here back on the original, okay, there's a tiny little bit available. But if we go and isolate it, you can see it's made up of 5 different texture sets, each one using 4K textures. And we took a lot of care to kind of handcraft them in Substance Designer and Substance Painter to allow for some procedural variation. And I can zoom way in and still have the quality good on these. And it's even got different blocks with different roughness values, so they reflect differently. And this is just one asset in the scene. When you look at it as a whole, everything, including the sidewalks over here, which are almost never seen a little bit, those have 4K and 8K textures. And even though things may not be directly visible, reflections are picked up, and the influence of their light, bounce lighting off of them is picked up by other objects. So by crafting everything at this high quality, it really stands out and allows the scene to kind of pop. And that's one thing we really wanted to stress, was this is a world that's been lived in, that's had its ups and downs, and Germania is pretty much Hitler's crown jewel. So it needed to kind of represent that grandiose, relatively clean, modern city without too much grunge, but still having some. It's lived in, of course, like people walk around, there is wear. And in terms of texturing, we had a pretty interesting workflow for it. We use Substance Painter and Substance Designer to craft the textures, and we have our own PBR node, which we use because Blender doesn't have direct integration with Substance Painter and Substance Designer. We created our own node, which allows us to plug in the substance maps easier without having to deal with generating a PBR-based node tree each time. And hopping over, you can see this fountain here. This is a relatively small thing, but it is present in the scene. So hopping over to Substance Painter, you can kind of see the amount of detail that goes into an asset even of that size. It's got 3 different material sets, which then have their different kinds of layers. We generally work with multiple layers for the like base material, the wear, ambient occlusion, and things like that. Like the bricks on the fountain here, they all have moss, some wear, different kinds of wear, like ambient occlusion from the ground that would come up from just being in proximity to it, wear around the bricks, and like something like moss, which would generally grow up in small amounts, but maybe not cover the whole thing because it's in a park that has people walking a lot. And this is then exported. We have our own preset that we use for Substance Painter for exporting. And something like this would probably be exported in 4K just to allow for additional quality in case it did need to be used in another shot. We like to keep it so that assets, if possible, can be reused, because it is nice to do unique assets for every bit in the scene, but realistically, that gets too crazy. So spending more time on making one high quality asset that can be reused is definitely beneficial. So once we've got the textures exported, we bring it into the scene, connect it to our node, and it's pretty much that for the materials. It's it's simple enough to get it going, but with something like this, which has thousands and thousands of objects, we definitely have to manage our time well and work with something of this scale. Now, back to Germania as a whole, I want to cover the linking workflow. Now, this is something that I mentioned before, and it's one of the aspects that I think has really kind of helped us work with multiple studios, like work with our partners at Barnstorm and just work with multiple artists. So generally how it works is you'll have the base scene, like in this case, Germania, that has a number of objects or assets which are part of the scene itself. Like the ones that I'm clicking on now are in the scene. But for something like the Volkshalle, which I showed before, it's unmanageable to have it in the scene. It just uses up too much memory, and something of that size may need tweaks up until pretty much the end of the production. So we want artists to be able to work on it independently from the scene itself. So with that linking workflow, it lets multiple artists work on those assets. So somebody right now could be working on the Volkshalle. They could be changing the textures or doing whatever. And then once they're done, they would save that file. I could even have my Blender file open. I could go to Blender file over in the outliner and then scroll until I find it. Right click, hit reload, and those changes that they made would instantly propagate once I hit reload. And that kind of workflow is immensely beneficial. We use that for the people, the cars, the Volkswagen in this case. We use it for the trees, pretty much anything that seems like an artist would need to work on it independently that will have iterations throughout the process will be used with that linking workflow. And let's take the cars, for example. Now, they're moving around the scene, they drive through, and there's a number of different kinds. So for something like the cars, we have a couple of different layers of linking. First, we have, well, working backwards from the scene itself, you have the first setback, which is a cars scene. Now, this is just the cars themselves on a road moving. And as you can see, these are all linked in. Each different vehicle is linked in. They're all connected to their main empty right there. And going further back, you can go to an individual vehicle, which is its own base file. Now, this is kind of the core file that all of the other linking ones reference. And you can look at this. It's a pretty nice car. We have an HDRI so the artist can preview it. It's very high quality. And this is then put into a rig file, which then goes into the car scene, which then goes all the way back to Germania. And it's definitely really cool. As a way to work, it was something that I didn't really use at all until I started working for Theory. But then once I realized how beneficial it was, it kind of became my go-to. And as you can see, it took a couple of minutes for that Volkshalle to re-update, but it beats having to close out the scene and pass it to another artist to have them work on it or deal with merging and propagation and things like that.
So as we're getting towards the end of this bit of a presentation, I wanted to highlight a few things that Ben said that in many ways we learned the hard way, and we also picked up from our friends at Barnstorm. Proper layer management is key. It's the only way that this scene was solved. And then from our perspective, a linking workflow was the only way that the scene was even manageable amongst the multiple artists that were on it. I think those two very key things that we planned out from the get-go, like this scene was planned out with multiple layers, is really the only way we could have built this whole shot, because it took an enormous amount of effort and a lot of folks to really coordinate everything. Ben, we've got a question from the chat, and it's about your machine. What did you use? And, while you're at it, why don't you tell them the story of what happened right towards the end of High Castle with your machine?
All right. So my original machine that I was using during High Castle was an i5 3570K, so a 4-core i5 processor running at I think I was running 4.2 gigahertz. Didn't have hyper-threading, and I was using an NVIDIA GTX 660 Ti, so a couple generations back. And it was kind of painful to work with. A scene like this was nowhere near as responsive as it is in my current system. So what happened right at the end of the project was we had a power surge at my house, and my machine just straight up died. Thank God it happened after the majority of the work was done, but if it had happened a week earlier, it would have been a nightmare. The whole thing just got fried, and I ended up rebuilding it with the current system. And the current system I'm using now in this presentation is an i7 6800K, which is the 6-core, 12-thread Intel processor, and GTX 1070 with that has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and then my system itself has 32 gigabytes of RAM. It's powerful enough to allow for multiple instances of Blender running and Substance Painter and so on. And even in terms of rendering, it handles it pretty well. Of course, I'd like to use GPU rendering when I can, but for a scene this complex, it's already using more memory by almost double than what my card has.
You remember some of the render times that you encountered when this was starting?
Yeah, so render times for this, each layer took a relatively significant amount of time. So let's say for the park left and park right layers, that's just what you're looking at here, that one and this one. Each one of these took, I would say, about an hour to an hour and a half per frame. Now this shot is about 250 frames. So you're looking at just 2 layers taking, let's say, 2 hours total per frame, and then multiply that by the 250 and then do that for each layer. Now some of them went a little bit quicker because they had less items, like these ones that you can see. But even then, we're talking about rendering at whatever that is there. So yeah, 7K, 8K resolution.
That's correct. We did have a super sample and overscan render these shots to give a little bit more leeway for the compositors.
Yeah. And overall, it was a pretty significant render time, but we did use Amazon AWS, and we were able to use both their 64-core and their 128-core machines. And when you have 150, 128-core machines all rendering at once, even if it does take an hour or 2 hour frame, it doesn't matter. You can have 150 frames done in 1 hour.
Yeah, we had machines which at one point our Amazon web specialist called us and said, we use these 128-core machines to simulate weather for the Weather Channel. And I was like, yeah, but I got a city to do, so give them over. Yeah, these machines are beastly, and Cycles really handled it like a champ. There's a couple of things I think we should also mention before we close this talk out. And I think one of the biggest is the fact that this scene is also a combination of multiple programs and add-ons. There's a lot of stuff that's involved here. We're using, for example, the Grove to do a lot of the trees. We also snuck in some speed trees towards the front there that are waving. On top of that, we're using Substance for all of our materials and textures because that was our full pipeline. And we use an add-on from a guy called One Lux forgot the full studio name, but I think it's One Lux Studio to kind of mix all of that together. We used alembic caches for the wind on the banners, so that was important. All the characters that are walking, they're like literally tiny pixels, but if you look really closely, all of those characters are massive characters. They were all simulated in massive. And on top of that, we built a pipeline that went from massive to Maya to Blender, and that was built by Patrick Crawford, who talked earlier, and augmented by Juan Pablo's Blend Rig. So that was pretty cool. Yep, there they are, our massive characters. The characters themselves were a combination of Fuse and MakeHuman. This year, I think we're going to explore Marvelous Designer, but Fuse and MakeHuman were our primary character generation pipeline. We had to generate quite a few characters, actually, in a really short amount of time.
Yep.
And then on top of that, we used a little bit of Pro Lighting Skies. A little shout out to those guys. We had to use that for our environment maps, and that was pretty cool. So, yep, there they are. So this scene is an excellent is an excellent combination of a lot of tools, and I think a testament to like Blender's ability to talk to multiple programs at once. We lost a lot of sleep. We pulled out a lot of hair on this one, but this one was pretty amazing. To answer a question from one person, you can keep this looping for one more minute and we'll be out. To answer a question from on here, how much does it normally cost to rent a space on the server? Well, I can tell you this much. The 64-core machine was running us at about 65 cents an hour on spot. Now, that's a good thing because, A, it's pretty affordable, but it's a downside because a spot instance can instantly be knocked off by somebody else who reserves it at full price. And it happened. So you ultimately end up paying full price anyways, which is about $3. Now, those 128-core machines on spot, they were like, what, $1 or $2 an hour? So that got to be pretty expensive pretty quick. But on top of that, we found, and we could actually measure this data, we found that every time we rendered shots overnight, we would like literally double the price. We would see these giant spikes because the price would go down at night, the bidding market for Amazon, but it would shoot like double the amount it was during the day because we're reserving every possible machine in our region for that. It's broken by region and then by family of machine, and we took as many of them as we could. Another thing that was a big consideration here was the file system talking to Amazon. And admittedly, we didn't come up with a great solution. We just relied on Dropbox business for that. It was okay, and I think there's room for a lot of improvement. But Dropbox served as our serving platform to all of the machines and also as a way for us to ingest all of the frames once we had them. I guess the last bit, and I don't remember if you mentioned this, is that we use multi-layer EXRs for everything.
Oh, no, I did not mention that. Yeah, the multi-layer thing was is definitely a wise idea to use if you're working with a compositing group, and even just in terms of having like motion vectors and a depth pass, and then the different indirect, direct, and color passes allows the compositors to have a much wider range to affect the image and make it fit tonally with the rest of the footage.
We did not use Filmic. I saw someone ask that. We did not use Filmic, but we used, I'm going to get his last name wrong, but Troy S. Spoka, something like that. He had written a color LUT that we used that allowed us to have a full range. That was only to see it inside of Blender when we were doing our lighting. Multi-layer EXRs and EXRs in general are linear, so they're written full linear. And Brian asked if we used Nuke to composite. Yes, Barnstorm. They handled all the compositing, and they used Nuke primarily to do all of the final composite of everything. And I think that's about it, man. This was a hell of a shot. And the one that got us, this one and the one that's going to be presented later, that was nominated for a Visual Effects Society Award against Game of Thrones. Now, granted, their budgets were 10 times higher, but not bad, not bad. Ben, do you have any closing statements or closing words before we hand it over to Brian?
This was a whole lot of fun to work on and taught me a huge amount about Blender. And I'd highly recommend anybody that's kind of investigating Blender just to dive right in and check out the multitude of add-ons out there. Definitely check out RenderMan for Blender. Like, Brian's an awesome guy, and RenderMan for Blender is kind of what got me into this and led me to Theory in the first place. So who knows, if you work with RenderMan for Blender, you may get a job. And that's about it. So
rock on, dude.
Yep.
Thank you for an awesome presentation.